Paul Williams'ı geçtiğimiz yıl Fethullah Gülen'in Pensilvanya'daki evi önünde gerçekleştirilen eylemlerden tanıyoruz. Amerika'da yaşayan Türkler Poconos Dağları'nın eteklerinde bu küçücük kasabada Fethullah Gülen'i bir değil, tam 2 kez protesto ettiler. Paul Williams, FBI ile çalışmış bir gazeteci. Yükselen İslami hareketlere dair araştırmaları ve kitapları var. Soluğu hemen eylemde alan Paul Williams için uluslararası alanda CIA, Fethullah Gülen ve Gladio yapılanmasından daha önemli bir hikaye yok. Biz de Amerika'ya gerçekleştirdiğimiz seyahatte kendisiyle tanışmak ve araştırmalarının sonuçlarını hazırladığımız belgesel kapsamında dinlemek istedik. Fethullah Gülen'in Gladio ve CIA bağını anlatan The Gülen belgeseli kapsamında gerçekleştirdiğimiz bu çok önemli röportajın uzun bir özetini sizlerle paylaşıyoruz.
My name is Paul Williams. I worked for the FBI for 5 years. A lot of the work I've done for the FBI resulted in arrests and convictions. I spent my life as an investigative reporter living in Pennsylvania. That's my father.
He was a politician.
He was a politician, yes. I'm doing this program because I think in my life as a journalist, I've spent my whole life writing. Once again, I've won many awards for journalism. There is no story internationally. There's nothing more important right now than what's taking place with the Gulen movement and what's taking place with the CIA and Turkey. People have to know that some terrible thing is being developed that will end up in the destruction of all nationalism, the destruction of everything that Ataturk stood for and fought for. It'll all be obliterated and it also within the United States, that our way of life is being compromised by Gulen and by this movement. And the repercussions of this are enormous. I was working with the FBI, and I was working with a lot of people from Israeli intelligence. And they said, look it, Paul, you're missing the boat. Where you live, you're only 45 minutes away from the most dangerous Muslim in the world. I said, what are you talking about? They said, there's a guy by the name of Fethullah Gulen who lives up in the Poconos. And he's right next to your house. You should look into him. Well, I started to look into Gulen, and several things immediately amazed me. I was looking at documents from the Institute of Strategic Research at the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League, one of our leading, most prestigious universities. And they uncovered the fact that Gulen, who I doesn't speak a word of English, and has set up over 140 schools throughout the United States. And he's been called a leading educator. He's been championed by Bill and Hillary Clinton. I started to dig further. And then I looked at his hearing. He came here in 1997, 1998 from Turkey as a fugitive. He landed in Salisbury, and when he applied for permanent residency here in the United States, the FBI said, this guy's dangerous. We can't have him in the country. We have to send him back. Homeland Security came to the same decision. This guy is trying to create a new Islamic world order. This guy is responsible for the toppling of governments. This guy is very dangerous. We cannot have him here in the United States. Well, at the same hearing, you had people like Martin Abramovich, who was a former ambassador to Turkey. You had people like Graham Fuller, who's a very prominent person in the CIA, saying, oh, Gulen is a wonderful educator. Gulen, it would be an asset to the United States. We must keep him here. So he obtained his permanent residency here. Now, after that, I started thinking that how could a guy like this, third grade education, why is he sheltered by the CIA? Why? And why does he have so much bloody money? And I figured I want to really meet this guy. So I went up on several occasions to Salisbury. I had a photographer with me. And I started talking to the neighbors. And the neighbors up there started to tell me things that were really alarming. They said, look at this guy Gulen, we're hearing from his compound up there. He has like a mountain fortress. We're hearing from this compound gunfire at night. And some of the gunfire is from semi-automatic weaponry. And around our houses during the day, there's a helicopter that keeps combing the area, looking for anyone who's trying to intrude on his property. I got this from neighbor after neighbor after neighbor. What's interesting about this is not just the gunfire and not just the helicopters, but the existence of a foreign army on U.S. soil. Now think about this. I mean, that should alarm everybody. I've appeared on numerous shows throughout the United States. I'm openly speaking to you right now. You would think that right now, since I'm reporting these things, that the FBI and the law enforcement would be down descending on me and questioning me, right? Doesn't happen. I wrote about Gulen in a book that appeared last year called Crescent Moon Rising. And it was all about Gulen, all about everything that we're talking about, CIA protection, about the gunfire up there, the standing army. Wouldn't you think that some law enforcement official would come to me, especially since I work with the CIA, with the FBI, to verify it or to question me? Sure. Doesn't happen. Somebody's protecting the compound. Like I said, I was up there. I spoke to the neighbors, and they have called the police. They've complained. I mean, if you were living in a neighborhood, nice, quiet neighborhood, way out in the country, and a helicopter is going around your property, continuously, eventually it would annoy you, and you would complain. Where's this helicopter coming from, and why do we have these, this weaponry in this compound in Sailorsburg? Yeah, they've complained, and nothing's done. So what does that tell you? It means obviously he's under some type of protection. When I was looking into the CIA connection to Fethullah Gulen, I discovered that there were CIA agents in his schools throughout Central Asia. In his schools, like in Turkmenistan and all these other places, if in all these schools the CIA is operating, then only an idiot would not realize that the CIA is very much involved in the Gulen movement. This I do know. It came to them. The Gulen movement was in existence. They realized that in these newly created Russian republics, there were vast oil and natural gas reserves. One of the richest areas in the world right now is Eurasia. And the fight for Eurasia is going to control politics for the oncoming centuries. Everything is there. The United States could not, in its mindset, allow these natural resources to be controlled by Russia or by China. We had to control that, because whoever controls that controls the economy. Whoever controls the energy controls everything. Well, how are you going to get control of these newly created Russian republics, Turkmenistan? How are you going to get control if you're an American? First of all, these places were part of the former Soviet Union. In all these countries, there's a very strong anti-American animus that they can't overcome. They're very suspicious of Americans. They're very suspicious of American enterprises. They've been trained that way for years and years and years. Well, how are you going to break into that? How are you going to get these natural resources? Well, the only way you can do that is to use Turkey as your proxy, the country of Turkey as your proxy, because all these countries share Turkish culture, Turkish background, Turkish history. They all have that in common. So what better way to gain access to these resources than through the Gulen movement? How can you do that? You establish the schools everywhere, throughout all Central Asia. And you have CIA agents involved in all these so-called educational enterprises, and you got your foothold throughout Central Asia. That's what happened. Paul Hellawell. He was stationed to work with the national Chinese who were fighting, the Chinese, of course, were on our side fighting the Japanese at that time. But what we did was we were working with the national Chinese, because we realized in 1945 that the nationals were going to be fighting Mao Zedong and the communists. So Hellawell realized that Chiang Kai-shek raised the money for his army by selling drugs to, throughout portions of China and throughout portions of Southeast Asia. Well, Hallowell, this is all documented, said, I got a great idea. We have this new agency that's being created, the CIA. They have no source of funding. Why don't we sell heroin in the United States? But the good thing about it is we don't need to sell heroin so that it would really disrupt the United States. We are going to just sell it to the blacks and the black communities because this is the truth. This is absolutely documented. You can get it, you can get the records. We will sell it in jazz clubs. And if so many people in the black community become addicted, it's not going to affect, the people in suburbia, the people in mainline America, and we'll make a lot of money from it. We'll make enough money to pay for Operation Gladio. That's how it all started. The source of the CIA funding for all of these enterprises is heroin. Always has been. Goes back to 1947 when the CIA made an agreement with Lucky Luciano to take over the heroin trade so that they could control the politics in Italy at that time, the 1948 election. They set up the narcotics trade, and the narcotics were coming at that time came from Turkey. When the Turks outlawed the cultivation of opium, this is during the 1970s, the CIA cultivated the crop in Southeast Asia, but what do you think right now with our invasion of Afghanistan? You're not, the one thing you're not allowed to do is to interfere with the poppy fields. Our troops can't go through the poppy fields. They can't step on one poppy. That's protected. And I mean, it's been verified time and time and time again in U.S. hearings that the source of all black operations by the CIA is heroin. Always has been. That's what financed Gladio. Gladio was completely fueled by narcotics. Without listen, the CIA, when the CIA was created, 1947, 1948, it received no allocation of funds from Congress. Do you know that? None. It had to get money somehow. Since it wanted to be involved in Italian politics and Turkish politics throughout the world, it had to engage in black operations, and that brought them right into heroin with the mafia. Well, first of all, this came out with congressional hearings going back to the Pike Committee. It came out in Congress that the CIA had established, for instance, banks throughout the world, like the Nugan Hand Bank in Southeast Asia, a whole chain of banks in Panama. This came out in congressional hearings that these banks that were controlled by the CIA, staffed by the CIA, were the source of their funding totally was narcotics. You're dealing with the flow of slush funds through a series of black banks. We know that the CIA established black banks throughout the world. One bank that they used copiously was the Vatican Bank. You have a deposit being made in Southeast Asia. You have that money flowing into a bank within Italy that might be controlled by Sindana or a member of the Italian mafia, going from there into the Vatican Bank, going from there into Switzerland, going from Switzerland into a Panama bank, and going from there to a Miami bank and back again. So I have traced this, and many other people have as well, that you are dealing with right now throughout the world billions and billions and billions of dollars in a CIA slush fund that has been going to people like Gulen to fund the CIA black ops. And there's a direct relation between the Bubbas in Turkey, who control the narcotics, and the CIA, and Gladio, and Gulen. I think that a lot of it is explained by the fact that Gulen and the CIA have created a country that doesn't exist. It's called Turkestan. Doesn't exist. It only exists on the maps of the CIA and in the imagination of Fethullah Gulen. It's part of China. It's where the Uyghurs live right now. They're Islamic. And that's the area that's, of course, very rich in natural resources. And we have created that with the Gulen movement. It doesn't really exist. But that leads me to believe that the CIA is using Gulen's concept of a new Islamic world order, the revitalization of the Ottoman Empire, to bring together all these newly created Russian republics under Turkey and eventually under the governance of the CIA and its global ambitions. It's not polarized at all. I don't think there's a dichotomy. I think that most people in the government, elected officials, if they know Gulen, they have a very favorable opinion of him, because Gulen has established a string of corporations, very powerful lobbying groups in Washington, D.C., with the result that over 6,000 congressmen, senators, legislative assistants in Washington, D.C. are now on the take from Gulen. You got to realize that even right now, the religious advisor to President Obama is a Gulenist. So if they hear anything about Gulen, it would more than likely be positive. And they don't look where the cash is coming from, where the gifts are coming from. They don't look into Gulen, because Turkey's like at the end of the world in America. It's people are, and Turkey as well. People anymore are very, very, very misinformed. They don't read. They don't accept behind the superficial. But yeah, Gulen right now, they would say, oh, he's met with the Pope, he's met with the Greek patriarch, he's such a wonderful guy, How could a guy like Williams be speaking about him? And they don't realize that really, if you look into the Vatican, there's really no record of Gulen meeting with the Pope.
There's a picture, right?
Yeah, interesting. There's nothing about Gulen that's real. First of all, he is not an educator. He's proclaimed to be this great educator. He can't speak English. He doesn't have a third-grade education. He's adding absolutely nothing to the educational enrichment of the world. Secondly, he is not a great scholar. People say, oh, he's a wonderful scholar. He has never written anything of note, never published anything of note. They say that he is this moderate Muslim, this model. He has never stood for moderate Islam. He stands for the most radical form, most militant form of Islam. There's nothing about Gulen himself. What everybody says about him, what the Clintons say about him, what Obama says about him, what Bush says about him, everything is a lie. There's nothing about him that's real. He's only a figurehead. His movement has been taken over by the CIA.
Madsen, Amerikan Derin Devleti ve CIA'nin dünya çapındaki faaliyetlerine dair çok çarpıcı raporlar yayınlayan bir araştırmacı gazeteci. Madsen aynı zamanda Gülen'in okullarını ziyaret etmek üzere Türkiye'ye de davet edilen gazetecilerden. Yani birinci elden kaynak ve bilgilere de sahip. Fethullah Gülen ve Yasin El-Kadın'ın 90'lar sonunda CIA ile bağlantılı olduğunu iddia ettiği rapor, Türkiye'de de büyük yankı yarattı. Yugoslavya'nın parçalanması projesinde Kosova'daki mücahitlerin CIA tarafından silahlandırıldığını ve Fethullah Gülen'in CIA'ye çok yardımcı olduğunu Amerikan istihbarat yetkililerinden bizzat duyduğunu iddia ediyor. Fethullah Gülen'in Gladio ve CIA bağını anlatan The Gülen belgeseli kapsamında internet üzerinden Skype bağlantısıyla gerçekleştirilen bu çok önemli röportajın uzun bir özetini sizlerle paylaşıyoruz.
I'm Wayne Madsen. I'm an investigative journalist. I also run a website called thewaynemadsenreport.com.
It's very important for us, and I really appreciate it today that you accepted the interview, because there are not a lot of people who are aware of the situation in States as well.
No.
Yeah. So
including some people in the when they had the trial, the hearing to pull Gulen's green card.
exactly.
A lot of people were shocked to hear Gulen's name associated with the CIA.
Yeah, they were. Were you able to follow up on the trial during the trial or afterwards?
I knew people who were attending the trial and talked to some of the prosecutors, and it was pretty clear that the Justice Department was firmly convinced that he was here in the United States courtesy of the CIA. Otherwise, apparently, they had information that would have made him what they call an undesirable alien.
Yeah.
Which is somebody who's tied up with either financial or other matters that are not seen as conducive to, the kind of person they want to have residency here in the United States. So, but they were basically overruled, as we know, by some pretty powerful people.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to start with the interview because we already started talking about it.
Yeah.
Initially, we have requested to talk about a report you have published, stated Fethullah Gulen and Yasin Kadi were both involved with the CIA in the late 90s. That was the report. Would you give us detailed review of that report you have published? What was it about?
Yes. My information basically came to me after 9/11, the 9/11 attacks. I knew a person who had tried to bring this information to the attention of the authorities prior to 9/11, but was rebuffed. That person was in charge of risk management for J.P. Morgan, which looked at unusual stock transactions involving the New York Stock Exchange, and some information came to her attention that a company in which Yasin Kadi was invested, called P-Tech, was very active. And then, of course, after 9/11, it turns out that P-Tech had all kinds of contracts for the Federal Aviation Administration, Department of Defense, and even the White House for various communication services. Then after 9/11, an individual named Sibel Edmonds, who was a translator for the FBI, Turkish translator, came forward with some information about what she said was criminal activity by people associated with the Turkish deep state, operating out of the Turkish embassy in Washington, but also out of the American Turkish Council and other lobbying, for lack of a better term, in the United States. And then that was the first time I heard the name Fethullah Gulen mentioned in relation to this whole issue of Yasin Kadi, and also the CIA using these Islamist networks to not only smuggle weapons to the Kosovo Liberation Army during the civil war in Yugoslavia, but also to the Chechen guerrillas in the first and second Chechen wars against Russia. So from there, it opened up a huge clandestine network of CIA arms smuggling. Sibel Edmonds also made accusations that drug smuggling was involved in some of these networks. But between the risk manager for J.P. Morgan and Sibel Edmonds, a huge picture opened up of the role these clandestine networks, like those operated by Fethullah Gulen and Yasin Kadi, played in a number of events. But especially the smuggling of weapons to various groups in Central Europe and the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. But these were accusations, am I right?
These were accusations, but they were from people who worked within worked within the system. The person who worked in the risk management branch at J.P. Morgan was also involved with a CIA venture capital firm called InQtel, an actual company that works for the CIA to invest money in various high-tech firms to get their products basically recognized and incorporated in many cases into the U.S. intelligence system. The other individual, of course, was a cleared individual with the FBI who was translating intercepted communications, people who didn't realize their phones were being tapped, and then translating those intercepts from Turkish into English. Not only Turkish, but also Azerbaijani and Farsi.
Yes.
I would also add that Sibel's information was about these groups was confirmed by other FBI agents who worked with her, who said, yes, this has been an ongoing problem for a long time.
Yes. Okay. Have you heard of something called Gladio? What is it?
Yes, Gladio, yes. Well, I know that there's a long history of behind Gladio, and it was one of the first people to bring it to the attention of the public was a Turkish prime minister named Gulen Terrorist, who was the first person, I think, who actually said there is this NATO option left over from the war called Gladio. And he, of course, stated it was active in Turkey. Other people later came forward and said Gladio-type networks were active in Italy and France and Belgium and other countries where they were intended to be stay-behind networks to arm guerrilla forces in the event of a Soviet invasion of Europe during the Cold War.
What were they operating on?
Well, what we know about Gladio, and it went by different names in different countries. As a matter of fact, later we were told that Gladio was morphed into what was known as Ergenekon in Turkey, but in other countries. And in Turkey, it was extremely right-wing groups who were building Gladio and had access to these hidden weapons. As a matter of fact, in Italy, it charged that the neo-fascists gained access to these weapons to conduct some terrorist attacks in Italy in the 1980s. One of which was a bombing of the Bologna train station in which many people were killed. These attacks were at first blamed on communists and left-wing groups. So here we have the classic false flag attack being used to blame the leftists for what was being carried out by extremely right-wing forces. So we saw that happen in Italy. We saw that happen in France with some other attacks there in other countries. And of course, in Turkey, the whole Ergenekon thing mushroomed into a huge scandal.
So what I understand is that these operatives conducted terrorist actions and blamed it on leftists. So what you suggest is that Turkey is going through the same phase with the Ergenekon case. Is that correct?
Yes. And of course, I think in retrospect, though, what we've seen happen with Ergenekon is something we've seen happen in other cases where it has become a red herring.
Which comes to my next question, because I have read a couple of other reports. In one of these reports, you mentioned there are indications that Gulen movement was involved to some degree with the Turkish deep state. And I was wondering your point of view on that as well.
Yes, I think if you look at the whole issue of Ergenekon and its ties to the Central Intelligence Agency, and then you look at Gulen's early years, where he also was accused of being involved with groups helping to smuggle weapons to groups where the CIA wanted to get weapons into, like the Chechens and the Kosovo Liberation Army. You can certainly see there'd be links between the Gulen people and Ergenekon. So, of course, the CIA would be very interested in helping a moderate form of pro-business, pro-globalization Islam being spread to these various countries.
Mm-hmm. In another report, Gulenist operations such as schools and civil society organizations. You regard to the schools and the civil society organizations as operations. What makes you regard these institutions as operational bases?
I saw in one Gulen High School where they were actually having mini Davos summits where the students would participate in a mini Davos, which is the Davos Forum in Switzerland is the height of, globalization and capitalism there is. But I saw that there was an attempt to recruit students in various countries, and of course, when the CIA is involved in recruitment, they're recruiting agents of influence, even young people, future leaders of the countries. This has happened in various places, but because the CIA has always traditionally been an Ivy League, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant type agency, with some very well-known Catholics involved. Obviously, an organization like that can't have access to Islamic countries like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan unless they go through some organization that already has links there that will promote their own causes, but also those of the CIA.
There was another very interesting report where you state Gulen, Fethullah Gulen, was a major CIA asset.
This is what I was told over the past several years by people who have a role in U.S. intelligence, have had a role in U.S. intelligence, people who are familiar with Gulen's operations, that he was very helpful to the CIA, number one, during the Kosovo and Bosnia wars. So two wars in the former Yugoslavia, but also when in the late 1990s, and especially 1996.
What I'm also interested about is, has CIA ever used clergymen before Fethullah Gulen?
Oh, absolutely. Look, the Dalai Lama of Tibet has been accused of being a CIA agent. Of course, he had contact with the CIA before his exile from Tibet, and even after, when the CIA was launching guerrilla operations into Chinese-occupied Tibet, it was with the blessing of the Dalai Lama and with the use of his people. So, yes, religious figures in the CIA seem to go together, and there have been some very nice fits over the years.
Mm-hmm. Another question of mine is about Turkestan. It's a government in exile, what I have read through your reports as well. Where does Turkestan and Fethullah Gulen relationship stand in that regard? Because we find Gulen referring to the region as Turkestan even before he self-exiled himself to the United States.
Yeah.
So what is their relationship?
The East Turkestan is blue. It looks like the Turkish flag, but it's blue. It's the East Turkestan Liberation Front. It's in China. It's Western China. I believe that, and I think this fits in very nicely with the CIA's goals, and also the goals of people like George Soros, who look at fragmenting not only Russia but also China eventually. So I actually dug up an old document in the CIA archives talking about the Pan-Turanian movement. And this document was prepared by a Nazi in Germany during World War II, and the CIA took that document, translated it from German to English, and was actually using it as some sort of blueprint or template for their own operations. And this is like right after World War II, when the CIA was a brand new agency in 1947. So obviously the CIA has had an interest that has paralleled the interests of Gulen and these Pan-Turkic people for a long time.
What do you think is CIA's, well, I'm going to put the question in present tense.
Yeah.
What do you think they try to gain from these operations, Gulenist operations?
Well, first of all, I think they want to promote a moderate form of Islam to compete with some of the more radical forms of Islam. I think that was the original intention, but I think presently there's a major problem with the CIA's operations in the Middle East, and it basically has to do with Syria within Saudi Arabia. Right now, for lack of a better term, I would say the U.S. intelligence operations in the Middle East are one big mess.
When you say radical Islam, what do you mean? Do you mean the terrorists that I understand with heavy guns or is there any other definition of radical Islam?
I don't think it's weapons, and I think a lot of the militancy associated with Islam has been exaggerated. I think radical. You can be radical and not take up weapons. You can be radical and want to seek a change in government, not taking up arms. I think Al Qaeda and this whole thing has served a lot of agendas. Not all of which are Islamic agendas. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of my meetings in Turkey with a government official, it was mentioned that they believed this individual believed there were Ergenekon's in Arab countries, and there was it was really made clear and that they wanted to that these Ergenekon's in these Arab countries were propping up the governments. And there was a clear interest in maybe getting rid of these deep states. And when I pressed the individual even more on it, it was quite clear what countries he was talking about. He was talking about Egypt and Jordan and Syria. And nothing has happened yet in Jordan, but we know what's happened in Egypt and Syria, where there was the Muslim Brotherhood came to power in Egypt, gone now, but also an attempt to overthrow a secular government in Syria, replacing it with a government that would probably, it looks like they would impose Sharia law.
Yes. Under a report that you published, you said, I quote, "The United States should never again turn over important foreign policy and national security positions to such baggage holders. They have brought their biases into high office and it has cost America and other countries dearly in terms of life and treasure." Now, this is a very important remark, and I do wish to hear in detail.
Yes. What I'm talking about are people who are given important positions of responsibility in charge of U.S. foreign policy, everything from the Secretary of State position to assistant secretaries of state positions, and also U.S. ambassadorships abroad. When these positions go to people who bring ethnic and religious baggage into the office, it really doesn't do any good for U.S. foreign policy. Speaking of Brzezinski, who was President Carter's national security advisor, is a Polish patriot. He's a Polish nationalist, Catholic who despises anything Russia. So he's the guy who got us involved in this terrible war in Afghanistan, where the U.S. supported what became Al Qaeda and came back to hurt us on 9/11. I could go on and mention Victoria Nuland, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, who handed out pieces of bread to people on Maidan Square in Kiev. Her people come from Eastern Europe. She has an intense dislike for Russia. She brings this baggage to office now and trying to give aid and assistance to neo-fascists in the Ukrainian government. The founders of the United States wanted the U.S. to be a non-aligned in the affairs of these old European countries, but some of the names I mentioned, they bring hundreds and hundreds of years of I would say, hatred for other European countries, other countries into office. And I think that has cost us quite a bit in getting involved in these wars. There was no reason for the U.S. to become involved with NATO and in destroying Yugoslavia. There's no business of the United States being involved in a civil conflict in the Ukraine, and certainly these lobbying groups, including the American Turkish Council, that was set up to be similar to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, weighed heavily on certain members of Congress to steer U.S. policy towards certain Turkish governments. And now we know it was only so Lockheed Martin and other big U.S. defense contractors would have a ready market to sell weapons and airplanes and whatnot to Turkey.
Well, since we're doing a documentary about Fethullah Gulen, is there anything else you would like to add on your behalf to the...
I would add that I was rather surprised that recently Gulen himself said he might have to go to Canada because he was fearful that he might lose his residency status in the United States. And if this is really the case, it would indicate that maybe Erdogan's government is applying pressure on Obama, and somehow this information has filtered through to Gulen, where he now feels that the U.S. is no longer a safe haven as it once was for him, and he's now toying with the idea of going to Canada. And Canada, of course, has a very conservative government, and maybe a better safe haven for him these days under Stephen Harper. Now,
why not come back to Turkey? What do you think?
I don't know under what government he would feel safe coming back. He's always expressed some fear that he would either be arrested or his life would be endangered by coming back. But you have to ask why does he believe that? Is it because some people believe he's really an agent of the United States and he might be targeted for some retaliation that way? Or I know people who have spoken to him personally, and he, although he claims he's just a religious figure, he really downplays the idea that he owns all these companies and he owns all this media and he's all this influential. He just claims he's just a religious man trying to do good work. So if that's the case, why doesn't he go back to Turkey? It means he's got other interests. He's got other interests that he's fearful that some of those other interests may come back to hurt him. If he goes on a witness stand, in a trial, the CIA then won't have any control over what he says.
William Engdahl, jeopolitik stratejiler üzerine 30 yılı aşkın süredir araştırma yapan bir yazar. Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nin Orta Doğu ve Orta Asya'daki stratejilerinin analizini yapan Engdahl, yepyeni bir kitap yayınlamak üzere. Amerika'nın Cihadı adını verdiği kitabında Fethullah Gülen'e de bir bölüm ayıran Engdahl, röportaj talebimizi kabul etti. Kendi tabiriyle Amerika'nın kutsal savaşını ve bu savaşın amaçlarını konuştuk. Fethullah Gülen'in Gladio ve CIA bağını anlatan The Gulen belgeseli kapsamında internet üzerinden Skype bağlantısıyla yapılan bu çok önemli röportajın uzun bir özetini sizlerle paylaşıyoruz. Hello, good morning.
Morning, Beste.
How are you?
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you very clearly.
Okay, I'm F. William Engdahl. I'm an author, a researcher of geopolitics. My background is in economics, but I've spent about 39 years of my life researching the connection between economics and realpolitik, as Henry Kissinger would call it, power politics, and how that actually shapes the geography of conflict in the world in the last 100 years or so.
Who's Fethullah Gulen? Have you ever heard of this name?
Fethullah Gulen, I first heard the name through Turkish friends of mine in Istanbul when I was on a speaking tour for one of my books. And as I dug more deeply into Fethullah Gulen, I realized that this was an absolutely crucial part of the strategy of this group from the CIA and Pentagon to accomplish this.
Mm-hmm. As I read your book, the chapter 10 about Fethullah Gulen, right in the beginning of the introduction to the chapter, you quote a couple of his words, the ones that caused him to self-exile himself to the United States, actually. You quote his words, and you note a CIA asset.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Fethullah Gulen as a CIA asset.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask about this.
This charge?
Yes.
Fethullah Gulen, actually, he is portrayed on his website as an Islamic scholar of great repute and so forth, but in fact, the man barely has a fifth grade elementary school education. He became an imam of sorts in his local hometown. He no longer calls himself an imam. But the interesting thing about Gulen, he was, in his early years, involved in extreme right-wing Turkish networks that often had connections with NATO and Gladio secret operations. But what's interesting about him is when he made those remarks that led him to flee Turkey for fear of his life or fear of imprisonment in the late 1990s, he was brought into the United States and given extraordinary green card residence status through the intervention of three people. Former ambassador to Turkey, Morton Abramovich, George Fidas, who has connections, or had connections, if he's still living, with the CIA, and an extremely critical person, Graham E. Fuller, who was a 25 years long CIA deputy director when he retired and went to the Rand Corporation. Graham E. Fuller is one of the critical architects of the CIA's use of Islamic fundamentalism, of the jihad ideology, and so forth, as a political weapon of the CIA and of the Pentagon to create chaos around the world against opponents of their policies. He would not have gotten his green card had not these CIA people or CIA connected people intervene on his behalf. The US State Department, interestingly enough, their lawyers argued in the court that gave him the green card, that gave Gulen the green card. They argued against giving Gulen a green card, saying, number one, he's no Islamic scholar, and number two, his movement has a very strange history, and this is not something we want to admit to the United States. The CIA faction intervened and won out, and even though the Erdogan government several years ago has said all the charges against Gulen will be dropped if he wants to come back to Turkey, I think today that would not be the case, but that's something else. That despite that, Gulen remains in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, in a very palatial retreat outside of the reach of people in Turkey. So why does he run his worldwide empire from Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, still to this day? The other thing is there have been documented cases, Russian intelligence documented after the collapse excuse me, of the Soviet Union, that the schools that Gulen rapidly established throughout former Soviet Union Muslim populations in Central Asia, in the Caucasus and so forth, that these schools taught English, and the English teachers were CIA agents. There were something like 500 CIA agents with a cover as English teachers infiltrated throughout Central Asia through the Gulen school networks. So all the evidence points to the fact that Fethullah Gulen is essentially an asset of the CIA that's being used, number one, to create a coup d'etat inside the institutions of the nation of Turkey, and number two, to use ethnic Turkish populations going right into China, actually, East Turkmenistan, they call it, to create destabilization across Eurasia. I think Gulen's role began to become clear on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some people in the CIA, especially people around Graham Fuller and that faction, had the idea, I don't think it was a very clever idea, that they could use the ethnicity of Turkic origin peoples going right into China, into Xinjiang province, Uyghur people who are originally a Turkic people, and create this Gulen ideology, and under the cover of creating these religious education centers to train elites in these very poor former Soviet republics, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, they tried, Turkmenistan, of course, and Kyrgyzstan and so forth, where there were historically large Muslim populations. They established their schools, they targeted the elites in those countries, and they said, we will give you the best education, we will bring your children to Turkey, to our universities, and make them into leading intellects. And of course, for the parents of these bright kids, it was a very seductive offer. It reminds me very much, I have to say, of the tactics and the methods of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. The Gulen movement, immediately after the spread into Central Asia, began to target Xinjiang province in China. And Xinjiang province is the westernmost province bordering Tibet province. And there, the Gulen movement began working among the Uyghur people, an ethnic group that are historically Turkic people. And what they would do is, when they were still below the Chinese intelligence radar, they would recruit young Uyghur students who would be quite normal students and bring them to Turkey into special Gulen schools, universities, and so forth. And in documented cases, they would come out of this education process as fanatical jihadists ready to die for Allah. And then they would be sent to places like Syria to do battle with Al-Qaeda type jihadist organizations.
Is there any special reason why they've chosen Xinjiang province, other than them being Turkic? Is there any other reason?
Well, the CIA has targeted Xinjiang province for unrest and destabilizations. The World Uyghur Congress is based in Washington, and Riba Kadir, the millionaire president of the World Uyghur Congress, works very closely with the CIA's National Endowment for Democracy, which is their vehicle for destabilizing countries and creating color revolutions and so forth. But the Xinjiang province is crucial, strategically crucial for China, because it's the, number one, it's the center of much domestic oil and gas production for China. But number two, even more critically, all of the oil and gas pipelines from Kazakhstan, from Russia, for the most part, have to go through Xinjiang province into the eastern parts of China. So if the CIA can put pressure or potentially create a terrorist movement in Xinjiang province that would blow up those pipelines, they could really wreak havoc, as they did, the same CIA did in Chechnya in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So
the U.S. has been fascinated by the Muslim Brotherhood since the early 50s, when certain people in the CIA in Germany, of all places, in Munich, recognized that former Nazis had recruited members of the Muslim Brotherhood and used them as anti-Soviet or anti-communist jihadists or soldiers, troops. And the CIA began to toy with the idea first of using them in Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, as broadcasting into their different language areas in Soviet Union and so forth among the Muslim populations. But then increasingly they got the idea that they could use the Muslim Brotherhood for different things. And the real shift began at the end of the 1970s.
Mm-hmm. And what happened in the 1970s?
At the end of the 1970s, people like Graham E. Fuller at the CIA and others in Washington began talking with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's security advisor, back in around 77, 78, and they conspired to create a provocation in Afghanistan that would force a Soviet intervention. This is a history that's since been confirmed by Brzezinski, but is virtually unknown to most of the world. The Soviet decision to go into Afghanistan to prop up the government there was made unwillingly by Moscow. They were very reluctant to do it, but it was made because the CIA had been covertly supplying arms and training to what were called the Mujahideen. So Brzezinski was convinced that this could be a devastating weapon against the Red Army, and then the U.S. propaganda machine went into full fury, as they're trying to do now against Putin over Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And they began to demonize Russia for trying to create World War III and invading Afghanistan. India would be next, and who knows what, and the whole world will be in a conflagration. Now, what's interesting about all that is the Saudi intelligence head at the time brought in a young Saudi from a very, very wealthy family named Osama bin Laden to essentially run the recruitment of jihadist Islam warriors from the entire Arab-speaking world. They were known in Afghanistan as the Arab Afghanis. And this was essentially the first massive use of the Muslim Brotherhood by the CIA as a warrior army, but by no means, unfortunately, the last.
Do you find Erdogan a representative of Muslim Brotherhood, political Islam?
Let me choose my words very carefully. As a
Sure.
non-Turkish citizen looking at events in Turkey from outside, my impression is, and I underline my impression is, that Prime Minister Erdogan is a very, very different person in his character and qualities from the movement of Fethullah Gulen, from the President Gül, who was very close to Gulen from all I could see, and from others in and around the AK party, Turkey. And I think initially Erdogan made a tactical alliance, electoral alliance with the Gulen movement in order to get the AK party elected with a clear majority, successfully so. I think he's more a pragmatist who is concerned with holding on to political power than the kind of person that Fethullah Gulen is. So I think what we see today is that fault line between Gulen and Erdogan has become an open chasm of conflict between the two. It's a life and death struggle who will survive. Either the CIA's proxy in Turkey will take over the institutions as they have done to a large extent or had done to the police, the judiciary, with these show trials of former generals and intelligence people and journalists and so forth to get any opposition to the CIA's agenda for Turkey out of the way. Well, I think Erdogan is much more pragmatic. He realizes more, perhaps, as a Turkish nationalist, and I say perhaps because I don't know him personally, that Turkey needs a different alliance structure, and that is, if Turkey were to go down the road further with NATO and the CIA, it would mean essentially the destruction of the Turkish state.
Do you think that it would be correct to think that CIA actually supports this war?
Oh, there's no question about it. I think what happened was that Erdogan himself began to become incalculable for certain people in Washington because he did not do the orders that they gave him. He did not do what Hillary Clinton demanded that he do by creating a full Turkish military intervention into Syria. He balked on many things that Washington wanted. And therefore, they decided it's time to get rid of Erdogan and bring in a more loyal lapdog, if you will, that'll bark when we tell them to bark and bark at who we tell them to bark at. And I think Erdogan was on the right track, Prime Minister Erdogan, when he criticized the American ambassador in Ankara and hinted that he might be declared persona non grata. I think the mistake of Erdogan was in not making the Ankara U.S. ambassador persona non grata, because all indications are that the U.S. ambassador is the key figure orchestrating the Gulen operations inside Turkey that are trying to destabilize Erdogan, as well as the movement in Syria and now in Lebanon, but also in Iraq, called ISIS, or the Islamic Caliphate.
Who are these people? Who are these terrorists? Where are they coming from? Because I know you have a lot of information about them.
The ISIS, I think the name ISIS is a very useful name to call this. I think it's a creation of the people in Langley, Virginia, who redressed the Muslim Brotherhood. The Obama administration has a strategy called Muslim Brotherhood. And the Obama administration, the CIA in particular, has cultivated the Muslim Brotherhood for decades, but certainly in the last period, to be the vehicle for this. Now, when the Brotherhood had a split with the Saudi government and Qatar was isolated, Qatar being the major financing base of the Muslim Brotherhood in the last years, isolated from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the Emirates, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, the monarchies, the United States or the U.S. intelligence reorganized the Muslim Brotherhood as something called the ISIS, the organization to create this, what's now been proclaimed as a caliphate worldwide. They're not modest people. They want the whole piece of cake. So it's a death cult. It's all the atrocities that you mentioned have been documented. They're killing Christians. They're killing other Muslims who don't believe precisely as they do. And, these are psychopaths. They're fanatical psychopaths. The reports I've seen are that Francis Ricciardoni, the U.S. ambassador again in Ankara, is the key coordinating person, that the CIA is up to their bloody necks in this whole ISIS operation in Iraq. It's designed against Iran and Iranian influence inside Iraq. They have not given up. I think what they've done is reorganize their offensive under the name of ISIS, or now the Islamic State, such a nonsense thing, and started let these psychopaths loose with their beheading of people, their atrocities in the name of holy war, to simply be a terrorist force that would destabilize the entire region. That's what people in Langley, Virginia, and the CIA apparently want with this part of the world. It'll weaken China, they view. It'll weaken Russia. And after all, the great game, as Brzezinski identified it back in 1997 in his book, the great game is to prevent Eurasia and the nations of Eurasia from coming together in a coherent economic space that would challenge the sole superpower hegemony of the United States. And that's exactly what's happening, ironically.